What is this thing called international criminal justice?
It's something that never existed until 30th of September 1946, the day of the judgment at Nuremberg. Because until then, international law was something that was entirely a matter between states. Individuals were not the subjects of international law. They couldn't be prosecuted. The heads of state, political and military leaders were all endowed with what was called sovereign immunity, which meant that another state, they could be prosecuted by their own state, but not by any other state or a collection of states. The first and last attempt before Nuremberg to put a leader on trial was made at Versailles by the British. They wanted to hang the Kaiser Wilhelm. He had invaded Belgium without any provocation. He had set up unrestricted submarine warfare, which meant that the convoys between America and Britain were sunk by U-boats, and very often civilians, sailors, were machine gunned in the water. These were hideous crimes, of course, and the British came to Versailles wanting to change international law, wanting to set up a court. And they got as far as Article 227 of the Versailles Treaty. Says that 5 international judges shall be appointed to try Kaiser Wilhelm, the head of Germany. Had he been tried, Hitler, years later, might have been given pause, may not have even come to power. But he wasn't tried, and he wasn't tried then because of America, because of Woodrow Wilson and his Secretary of State Lansing. They were adamantly opposed to any trial of the German war machine, because I think from Wilson's case, and this was one very far-sighted in some cases, not in this, because he thought that a trial would interfere with his plan for a League of Nations. Germany would not join if there was a trial. Lansing was a purist as far as international law was concerned. He said there is no precedent for putting a head of state on trial. International law, war law, doesn't go that far. We can't do this. So it was because of American opposition that, far from hanging the Kaiser as the British wanted, the Kaiser remained happily in Holland until he died in his bed in 1941, entirely unhung.
We seem to be having more atrocities like the extermination of the Jews in so many different countries around the world.
Ethnic hatred didn't end with Nuremberg. It didn't put an end to this virus of ethnic hatred, which in a strange sort of way during the Cold War was contained in many places. In the Soviet Union managed to contain pretty well the ethnic minorities in some cases who are now breaking out in places like Chechnya. Yes, I think ethnic hatred is so dangerous and so incendiary that you cannot say that an international criminal court, international criminal law, will necessarily deter it.
Can I take it that you do have some hope?
Yeah. Yes, I think that the sense of it all will fall into place. I mean, what do you do to people like Pol Pot and Idi Amin and Emperor Bokassa and Mengistu, and people who have died happily in their beds without ever being called to account for the mass murder of their own people? It is simply, I think, wrong in principle that people like that should live happily ever after. The only way to bring them to account when the country itself is in their thrall is for international action via humanitarian intervention, via setting up international courts, bringing them before it, and dealing with them for their crimes. That is it seems to me, however difficult, and yes, we are having trouble. Rwanda and The Hague the trials have been too long, they've been too expensive, but we're slowly and surely sharpening the processes. And so hopefully the great idea of Nuremberg, to come back to the subject of the discussion, was the great breakthrough that Nuremberg made and the legacy that it left to the world, was the idea that you can't get away with mass murder and tyranny, that tyrants should not have impunity, the right to carry on destroying the liberty and lives of their subjects. So that legacy can only be collected today through a legal process. Nuremberg was a legal process. It was a good legal process for 1946, but things have moved on. So we need to devise, and we are devising. We're in this. I think what always strikes me as important to say is that we are at a very rudimentary stage in this process of developing a system, a legal system for retribution. Nuremberg, 46, nothing happened for 50 years. You know, we had lots of conventions, conventions against racism, apartheid, torture, the so-called good conventions, but they never had enforcement mechanisms attached. And someone looking at Rwanda in 1994 said, you know, the road to hell is paved with good conventions. They were utterly futile. But slowly the setting up of the ICTY and ICTR, fig leaps. I mean, the UN was pathetic in Bosnia. The UN was worse than pathetic in Rwanda. 1 million people were killed while the UN Security Council looked the other way. And so it set up courts, I think, really as something of a fig leaf, as a PR job to cloak its own lack of action. But justice has its own momentum. And 10 years later, there's Slobodan Milosevic on trial, something undreamt of. I mean, in 1994, 10 years ago, no one would dream that General Pinochet would have been arrested in London and kept under house arrest. It was mansion arrest, in fact, but he was kept under arrest for 18 months. He'd come to take tea, as he had many a time and oft with Mrs. Thatcher. In fact, it was whiskey he usually took, but there it is. He was arrested, and that sent shockwaves around the world, and it led to, it was the first time that Nuremberg really came alive. Yeah, a man who has tortured and killed thousands of people should not strut the world stage. And it was astonishing. I was in England at the time and involved in the Pinochet proceedings, and the telegrams that came into the British Foreign Office from George Bush Sr., Henry Kissinger, of course, the Pope, Fidel Castro. Would you believe Fidel Castro sent a telegram urging the release of Pinochet on the basis that it was an insult to every Latin American leader? that is how shocked the world leaders were that the Nuremberg legacy should be so starkly and surprisingly revived more than 50 years later. So we are at a very early stage, and I think if we were looking back on this in 100 years' time, scholars will be saying this is a time in which something that was so obvious and is so accepted in 2099 was being worked out painfully and with great difficulty. But these were very early pioneering days in the struggle for a global justice that I hope will be in reasonable shape in a century's time.